Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I work here at Connecticut's Old State House, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to our June conversation at noon. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Jason Mancini about 19th century industrialist, political activist, and community leader Isaac Glasko. I did want to remind everyone that today's program is continuing our program theme of choosing to participate, which is based on the recent release of the Connecticut Civic Health Index. This report, as you know, measured our state's level of civic engagement, including on things like working with neighbors on a community issue, something we're going to learn a little bit about today. We are very indebted to our program series funder, Connecticut Humanities, who funded today's program and the program series, and we also appreciate the support of our co-sponsor of today's program, Connecticut Explored, the magazine of Connecticut history. I did put out copies of Connecticut Explored. There are also some at the back if there's not one on your chair. We do ask that you please fill out the program survey that's been left on your chair. We do actually read them, and we always appreciate your suggestions for upcoming programs. I would ask that everyone at this time please take out your cell phone and silence your cell phone or any other electronic devices that you have with you, as we are recording this program for Connecticut, for the Connecticut network. Of course, I cannot start a program without an infomercial, and I would like to invite you back to the Old State House in 2 days on Thursday evening to join us for a town hall meeting with nationally known speaker Eric Liu. It should be a really, really interesting program, and so do come back for that. And then our farmers market is starting up now that we've hit June, and the farmers market will take place on Tuesdays and Fridays in June. Our first summer concert is on June the 13th with Thomasina Levy, and then later in the month, you can spend your whole month with us. Later in the month, on June the 23rd, will be a table talk with reporter Mark Zinni, and on June the 29th, a table talk with a retired Fire Chief Teal from Hartford. And now, it is my pleasure to move this show on and introduce my colleague from the Connecticut Network, Diane Smith.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you for coming today. Imagine a village in Connecticut named for a man of color, a man believed to have Native American and African blood. A man who made such an impact in Connecticut that he is remembered in this way, with his name on a village. Misspelled, but named for the village is named for him. It's a little surprising, isn't it? Well, now imagine that this man lived and died before the Civil War. Even more surprising, and certainly a little-known bit of Connecticut history. The man was Isaac Glasko, who was a successful industrialist who became a political activist, a social anchor in his community, and a mentor to other men of color, helping them learn trade and earn a living. His story highlights both the opportunities for and the limitations of people of color during the early 19th century. Here to tell us more about this extraordinary person is Jason Mancini. Dr. Mancini is the director of the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, which just recently reopened under his leadership. He is an adjunct professor of anthropology at Connecticut College. He also heads the Indian Mariners Project, a collaboration of scholars who are interested in the historic relationship between Native American people and the sea. His current research project focuses on urban Indian communities, Indian social networks, race and ethnicity in New England, cultural landscapes, and oral histories. Please welcome Dr. Jason Mancini.
Thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be able to talk a little bit about such an exciting story, certainly to me and certainly to the communities that I work with in southeastern Connecticut. What I'd like to do sort of talk a little bit about what got me to this point, focusing on Isaac Glasko. I have spent the better part of the past 20 years or so studying the population of color across the region and trying to understand really the impact of colonization both on American Indians and also the African population during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. The stories are incredibly rich, and there are many narratives that deserve further exploration. Isaac Glasko seems to be at the intersection of many of these stories. So I'd like to highlight a little bit about his life while trying to tell a larger narrative regionally, nationally, and even internationally. What I'd like to do is call a little bit of attention to the region's cultural landscape. I thought this was going to be a bigger screen, but I think you can get the general gist that that is southern New England. And it is a very rich cultural landscape. You might be able to pick up some of the red dots that highlight various Indian communities that exist on the landscape in this region in the 18th and 19th century. And just to sort of create a scale of impact here, there are about 9 million acres of land in southern New England. And by the American Revolution, about 30,000 of those acres remained in Indian hands. And the cultural landscape was radically transforming, both environmentally, socially, culturally, politically, all of these things. I call attention to the American Revolution because Isaac Glasko was born just at the beginning of the American Revolution. So we call attention to the sort of ideals that are being set forth by revolutionary leaders, freedom, liberty, equality, all of that. So there's a very rich narrative in the region, in this particular location, where Isaac Glasko is emerging as an adult. He was actually born on the borderlands of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, in that area, and got a start in the birthplace of America's Industrial Revolution along the Blackstone River, where he had an early forge on the river. And in the early 1800s, this particular location happened to experience a pretty significant flood, a 200-year flood that destroyed the entire corridor, including the house. And this is captured in a regional history of Woonsocket that describes him specifically and his family and the impact it had on them. Fortuitously, though, the year before, he had acquired a piece of land in Preston, Connecticut, having identified an area for some reason, but no doubt the important piece of this was the old iron works that had with it a privilege to open a dam and erect a flume, as you see here in the land record, quote, for the purpose of carrying on the blacksmith business. What might be hard to see here, and I'm going to meander a little bit, is Glasko's property emerged right in this area of the Patchogue Forest, Patchogue Pond area. You can see Glasko Pond is here. He acquired with his father and his brother a total of about 70 acres. As I just want to sort of mention, too, in this environment of post-revolutionary or early America, we not only have the story of dispossession of people and the enslavement of people, but opportunities that begin to emerge during that time. And one of the things that we see up in this area is a small freeholding community of color. Several families begin purchasing land adjacent to one another in the 1760s and 1770s. Now, these types of communities are all over the place in southeastern Connecticut and beyond. I covered about 400 land transactions in New London County alone that tells a really important story. But this is where we begin to see indigenous women and African men coming together and mixing, if you will, and sharing these histories and complicating this colonial narrative of citizenship, of ownership, and of the particular rights that exist for different people of color. So Glasko is in close connection with these people, members of the Cocheats, the Wanton, and the Moody family, as well as a broader population of color in this area. There are about 8% of the population in this area are people of color. So Glasko acquires with his father and brother a significant parcel of land. He builds He builds the dam, secures water rights, and begins operating, through his experience in the Blackstone River, a trip hammer forge, which industrially is really an important transition. This isn't just a handheld hammer and anvil. This is a water-powered forge, and he's able to generate tremendously productive tremendously productive operation that employs many men of color. He's employing upwards of 30 people at a time. His operation becomes very successful. You can see here, well, you can't see here, but there's a graphic illustrating what a trip hammer forge looks like, somebody using it, and this is the actual image of Glasko Dam as it stands today. It's been modified through subsequent industrial activities, but no doubt this is the location where his original impoundment existed that controlled the water power for Glasko Pond. His house, his dwelling houses and other mills and other resources on his property would have been sort of behind the camera at that point. So Glasko develops this business around his industrial techniques and blacksmith knowledge. And as he's employing people, he's also becoming quite an adept marketer. He begins advertising his wares across the region, not just locally in Norwich or New London. We start to see advertisements in Middletown and Hartford and Providence and beyond. And he's very well known for this. It begins in 1810. With the advertisement of scythes, it moves on to axes. You can see a sort of progression through and maybe even predicting of different marketing needs. As he's looking at ox carts and wagons, it might reflect the harvesting of salt hay from marshes or westward migration during this time period. And as we move into the 1830s, as New London has become a significant whaling port, New London, Mystic, and Stonington anyway, he's beginning to deploy whaling irons, a variety of different kinds of implements you can see here. He becomes very, very good at this. He builds partnerships and is able to generate tremendous wealth. We know this through the fragments of information that we have. And I should sort of back up for a minute and just say that what we know about Isaac Glasko is merely from fragments. I've been able to accumulate many, many documents from different sources, but they're very fragmentary. He never left behind an autobiography. He never left behind any kind of business records that are known at this point. I hope that at some point they might turn up. But these are significant ways that we're able to begin interpreting his life and experiences. So as he's building up this business around the blacksmithing, people are becoming very jealous of his wealth. He now owns 4 houses. He has different kinds of mills. He has 100 acres or 70 acres. He's employing a lot of people that are doing very well for themselves as well. And we'll see the impacts of that later on his activism. But I do want to mention briefly, he becomes a social anchor in a time period when we begin to see some rising animosity between the Anglo population and the population of color. If I can reflect for a minute back on those land transactions and the accumulation of land by people of color, really we begin to see that trend through most of the 18th century. But it peaks at about 1800. You begin to see more acquisitions of land than sales of land. After 1800, we begin to see that trend reverse, where you start to see more sales than acquisitions. And that continues through the era of the Civil War. And that correlates as well with a demographic shift of the population of color to urban centers. So we begin to pick up an environment that's clearly becoming a bit more discriminatory or unfavorable to a population of color. Whether of Native ancestry or of African ancestry, or of the other ancestries that begin to find their way into various ports from around the world in the region. So we begin to see the documentation of the population of color in this region through the federal census. And I just want to call attention very briefly to, and I'll sort of, in my remaining time here, I'll call attention to a couple of different things that reflect the emerging activism during this time. But as land becomes harder to acquire or harder to maintain, we begin to see the political marginalization of people of color. The federal census is an important part of that. In 1800, the population of color is being enumerated across the region. By 1810, however, 13 of New London County's towns systematically eliminate the population of color from being enumerated in the federal census. Some in Rhode Island even refer to the population of color individually or familially just with the letter B for black, to produce a level of anonymity that, that sort of masks who is on the landscape. You can see here by 1820, this is the 1820 federal census for Griswold. Preston divides its parishes, and in 1815, the area where Glasko had lived became Griswold. So we have the 1820 census for Griswold, and you can see here he is essentially this half of the census enumerates the population of color. His father, Jacob, is enumerated here. This is Isaac Glasko with his family and probably some borders here. Some other members of the population of color show up as well. And on either side of these census pages, you will see a larger population of color that gives a better reflection of the broader community. That said, Glasko is creating an enterprise here that becomes a very stable form of employment for a larger population. He begins to train men. He trains their sons, and in some cases, their grandsons. For 60 years, he's at this business and becoming quite a center of political and economic activity. This is nearly impossible to see, but this is a list of men that trained with Glasko in Griswold. 2/3 of the known, actually, I'm sorry, 3/4 of the known blacksmiths of color had some type of association with him across the region. So what I've been able to see is that he's training these men, he's benefiting from their labor, but then they are going out beyond to their communities and becoming new anchors on a broader region. So there becomes a connectivity across the region, a social network, and that will emerge later, as you'll see, as I get to the political activism. Just to be specific, he has a familial tie to the Mashantucket Pequot community. His wife's brother married or cohabited with a Mashantucket Pequot woman, and their children grew up on the reservation there. But then one of those children apprenticed with Isaac Glasko. In the 1840 census, you see them next to one another. And by 1850, he's in New London opening up his own blacksmith shop. And you can start to see the way that this relationship begins to reflect itself, or reveal itself, I should say. And we have hotel records that Isaac Glasko is actually staying in New London at the time that his nephew, Pardon Brayton, is setting up his shop. So there's some really important links that allow us to see some of this activity. So as his business begins to flourish, as I said before, he begins to be challenged by his white neighbors. And he's the subject or involved in a number of lawsuits. He's probably one of the most litigated people in Connecticut archives, whether he's sued or being or doing the suing. He's in a number of cases, mostly over debt. But there's a moment in 1823 where he and Pero Moody and other persons of color from Griswold petitioned the Connecticut General Assembly, and I think it's large enough you can read it, but the petition was read and referred to the Select Committee, setting forth the grievances resulting from their exclusion from all places of honor, trust, or profit, praying exemption of their persons and property from all taxation, they not being in any way respected. This emerges out of that 1810 absence from the federal census and an ongoing anxiety across the region that's mounting around people of color, and Glasko's own personal business transactions, in which, just as this is coming out, he's in the middle of a series of those lawsuits where he sues one of his business partners. His business partner countersues him and for poor accounting. Or the business partner did some poor accounting, and Glasko ended up being fined or forced to pay $700 to his partner, which is about $15,000 today in today's money, which is not a small amount of change. So he began to advertise the dissolution of this partnership and that any debt should be paid. But you begin to see the roots of his activism right here in this moment, where he does not believe that he's being taxed and represented, and wants to call attention to that division or that hypocrisy that begins to emerge. There's a bit of a gap in the following 5 or so years, but interestingly, Glasko shows up by 1827, in August of 1827, becoming a local agent for Freedom's Journal. And this is interesting because this journal predates by several years William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator. And this is a journal that's owned and managed by the population of color. And it's highlighting important aspects of the population of color locally, regionally, nationally, some very important issues. And he is the one distributor across the area who's becoming quite active in local issues regarding the population of color. So much so that following a discussion, a two-week editorial discussion of the African recolonization movement that many of his peers were involved in, he actually puts up his entire property for sale during this time. And you can see this is the only known image of that property from an old postcard. But he describes it at this point. Known by the name of Glasko's establishment, his description following: a blacksmith shop with 7 fires and bellows by water power, 2 hammers, 2 grindstones, all by water power, a finishing shop for size and other work, all under the same roof. It's one of the best of its kind in the New England states, and stands in high repute. This is really sort of significant, 1828, where my interpretation of the evidence is that he's really beginning to think of the tone of race relations, decidedly negative disposition of what's being experienced by the broader population of color in this region. And he's starting to do something about it. More than that, what I think is really important to call attention to is the other forms of activism that are going on during this time. I mentioned earlier his relationship with the Mashantucket Pequot community. During the late 1820s and very early 1830s, there's a young Methodist minister named William Apes, Pequot minister, who's actually the first American Indian autobiographer. And he gets quite involved in the politics of Indian land rights, both here, and he actually ends up going up to Mashpee, Massachusetts, and getting involved in some land rights issues up on Cape Cod on behalf of that tribe in a sort of popular uprising called the Mashpee Revolt, or the Woodlot Riot, which was a nonviolent revolt, but happening at the same time that Isaac Glasko is involved peripherally in another issue locally. And I'll call attention to Prudence Crandall at this point, where Glasko's niece and the daughter of one of his apprentices were students of Prudence Crandall. And they were some of the students that were in the schoolhouse in 1834 when it was attacked, and went through all of that. So Glasko is really at the center point of many of these really important issues addressing the rights, roles, and experiences of the population of color. I thought I would, how much time do I have? Am I close? Okay. I thought I'd call attention to his younger half-brother, Jake Glasko. This is the only known image of one of his immediate family members. And you'll note that Jake Glasko is identified as an Indian from Woodstock, which is part of the Nipmuc ancestry that I believe Isaac Glasko was connected to. So Glasko, as I've sort of reflected on here, is a centerpiece not just in the region's population of color as a social anchor. He's really a significant participant in the region's economy, flourishing economy for people of color. Probably is one of the wealthiest people of color in the region during his life. And he became quite active in ways in terms of the civil rights movement during that era, calling attention to the tone of race relations in the 1830s. I mean, this is Jacksonian America. This is the era of Indian removal. This is the antebellum era, where things are getting decidedly negative in terms of race relations. So I think Glasko's role here really needs to stand front and center in terms of the local heroes that people should and can be paying a little bit more attention to in terms of our local and regional history. There are many more people like him, I'm sure, but he certainly stands out in my mind. So thank you.
Would you join us on the panel? Can I have the panelists join us?
Disconnect that.
Sit down.
Sure.
What an interesting story. I don't know how many of us knew that much about Isaac Glasko, but that was a very interesting story. Jason, thank you so much. Joining us now for our panel discussion, and if any of you would like to ask questions or make comments, please raise your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone. But joining us now is Kathleen Housley, who is the author of 8 acclaimed books ranging from women's history to material science and poetry. It's quite an array. She has written for numerous national journals, including the Christian Century and Image. She's a freelance writer and editor doing business in Glastonbury. And one of her books is The Letter Kills, and we do have copies of this right after this talk in the museum shop. The book is called The Letter Kills, but the Spirit Gives Life, and it tells the story of the remarkable Smith sisters of Glastonbury, who were abolitionists, suffragists, and feminists, and we'll have more on them coming up in just a moment. And also joining us is the Right Reverend Dr. John Selders, an ordained minister who serves in the United Church of Christ, the organizing pastor of Amistad United Church of Christ in Hartford, and the associate chaplain at Trinity College. Bishop Selders, thanks for being with us. I should say he is also an award-winning songwriter, musician, and performer, a teacher, a lecturer, and an activist. 12 years he lectured at Yale Divinity School, and Bishop Selders has served on the faculty of several other theological schools. And we have one of our youngest members of the audience joining us today. How nice to have them getting started early on learning our Connecticut history. Bishop Selders, I want to start with you because I want to bring what Jason was talking about into modern day. You have said in some of the talks that you've given that it's important to take risks to fight racism. First of all, what do you mean by that? And secondly, it strikes me that for a man like this, in his era, with his amount of wealth and notoriety, he took some very big risks.
Yes. My comments are really situated in my own personal story. I'm from St. Louis originally, so Ferguson was very important to me and still is when it jumped off August 9th, 2014. So I've watched, witnessed who I call my nieces and nephews lean into risk. At that time, it was tanks, rubber bullets, and tear gas, with literally their mouth and their bodies. And so for me, in this context, from that context, you know, teasing back over the centuries, over these decades, risk takes on some lived reality. Right? So that, you know, a person like Isaac Glasko in his time, with his wealth and his you know, personal power, also used that in order to leverage and aid not only his family, but the entire community, and at some cost. So when I say, you know, you lean into risk, what I often experience, especially here in New England, are the reservedness of it all. You know, we've nestled ourselves in what I call the Peyton Place syndrome. I mean, it's really nice and picturesque, especially during certain times of the year. And yet, when we talk about risk, we don't take very many. And so, you know, for us, I'm wanting to ask people to reconsider their ability, one, to take risk, and two, what that really means in a contemporary context.
Kathleen, I want to have you talk a little bit about these extraordinary sisters who lived in Glastonbury, because they also took risks, not only with their own fortunes and their livelihoods, but as women in the 1800s, they took a risk probably somewhat similar to a person of color. I mean, they really were putting themselves out there where they were not welcome in the public arena.
Absolutely. There were 5 sisters, and none of them married. And that's important in this discussion, especially when we get to suffrage, because in terms of constitutional rights as citizens, women were thought to be represented by the male members of their families. Well, they didn't have any after their father died. They didn't marry, there were no sons, there were no brothers, there were no uncles. They were the exception, which was going to undercut the constitutional idea that everyone was represented. Where the discussion for me is extremely important today is how these 5 women became activists. And I can tell you the moment it happens, or at least begins, because it's an evolving process. Julia keeps her diary for 40 years in French. And in 1819, this is very early, and we're about the same period of time here, Julia makes a note that they are teaching a Sunday school class for black children in Glastonbury. And then this starts a whole line of comments. They're beginning to sew clothes for the children so that they can come to Sunday school. And then all of a sudden, there's a note that says, the mother of one of the negresses came to church. She cannot read. And it's almost as if suddenly these 5 sisters see a deep injustice in their town. And it's an injustice so great that it's not going to be fixed by making dresses for the students. It's not going to be fixed by giving them food, which we see them doing. It's not going to be fixed by hiring, which we see them doing. That's all charity. The Smiths take it one step up. And they see it as a systematic evil. And they will, over the 1820s, become abolitionists. And they will not just be abolitionists at arm's length. It will not be, oh, we are against slavery in the South. The Smiths always couple abolition of slavery with recognition of the rights of free blacks in the North. So this particular coupling, to me, is one of the most significant things about the Smiths. By the time they get into the 1830s, they are going to be doing petition drives. And the petition drives, which will be to end slavery in Washington, D.C., they will take those petitions into the South Glastonbury mills, not just the landowners in Glastonbury. Well, where is the cotton coming from in the South Glastonbury mills? All right? They are making a huge political statement here, going into the mills and having mill workers sign those petitions. And then they send them on to their congressmen in Washington, D.C. One more thing, just to show you the way they're thinking. Southern congressmen are annoyed at these petitions. They are coming in and flooding Washington. And they pass the gag rule. No more petitions. You can bring them in. We're going to throw them away. And it's John Quincy Adams, who is now a congressman, not a president, who says, I don't care. I'm presenting them anyway. And will continue to do it. So you get this very powerful recognition of going from, wow, they can't read. Wow, they need clothes, to, wow, we have got to become a voice for people who cannot speak. And we must become that voice in concert with them, in teamwork with them, not just white women in Glastonbury. So
Bishop,
that's how
it strikes me that they were thinking in a very sophisticated way when they linked the cotton that was coming into the mills that was making people in New England wealthy with slavery.
See, I find this very fascinating because at the same time period, we had the first 2 African-American churches that get started here in Hartford and in New Haven. And both of those churches got started because they were not allowed to occupy seats in those established downtown first churches. Our famous First Center Church, First Church of Christ Congregational, did provide space in their parish house for this newly burgeoning, forming congregation that ultimately settled just around the corner here and became Talcott Street Church. It was the first colored congregational church. Same thing happened in New Haven to start Dixwell Avenue Church. At the same time, 1829, David Walker's Appeal was written. And that took on a life of its own. It is said that it was related to some of the revolts and some of the slave revolts in the South. People were reading, Nat Turner in particular, read David Walker's Appeal and then was inspired. The link I want to make is that there is this movement that is happening. I mean, this very place has a connection to that movement by the time we get through the 1830s into the 1840s with the Amistad case and this seminal civil rights case, if you will. And I want to say, and I'm glad you made the connection, that it is not just the doing for in a charity sense, that really justice is related to quality of life. And if we are to really, that for me is what I'm suggesting when I say we lean into risk. It is not just the thing we do for the moment. It is the question of how do we shift and become a more just, a better society, and that we, the people, get a chance to do that.
Jason, I wanted you to talk a little bit more about what Isaac Glasko did in terms of his petition to the legislature.
Well, I think it was a big step for he and the other folks to really take this on. And I think in reviewing some of these records, it became clear that it wasn't just him. It was a number of people that really engaged this, and these were literate people. They were writing their petitions. They were knowledgeable about constitutional law. They were knowledgeable and reflecting on what the American Revolution was fought for. In fact, some of these folks, Pero Moody and his brothers, were enlisted in the American Revolution. They served in the war. At the time Isaac Glasko was being born, but to sort of to engage that conversation on that level. Representation and taxation and the rights and freedoms that they should deserve as equal parts or equal shareholders in the early republic.
And so I think that most of us understand that, part of what the impetus for the revolution was no taxation without representation, right? No representation with the mother country, so the colony breaks away. And yet, his petition that he shouldn't pay taxes because he doesn't have rights, in fact, he's not represented in any legal way, falls on deaf ears. And then the sisters eventually, years later, also come to that same conclusion. And let me have you tell about, now this is many years after what you discussed with their initial activism about the abolition, but many years later, when they're elderly women, two sisters are left, they also find themselves involved in taxation without representation.
Absolutely, and this is when I said at the very beginning, keep in mind that there are 5 sisters with no male representation. What happens is that under the abolition, women and blacks and anyone who is involved in that movement come to see how the Constitution works or doesn't work. And they also learn how to organize. How do you do the newspaper, for example, getting that newspaper out? How do you do petitions? How do you get reporters on your side? That's all learned under abolition. Then you get to the Civil War, and for the Smith, they kind of say, okay, well, we've helped to end slavery. Gee, we're still not voting. And this is where they become, there were the 5 sisters in the 1870s, there are only 2 left, and they're in their 70s and 80s. And at this point, again, they are going to make a constitutional argument, and it's going to be a powerful one, that they are being taxed, and because there are no male members of the family at all, they have no representation. It's the same argument coming out of abolition, and they fight this battle in a very humorous way. very intelligent way, but they have a sense of humor about it. For example, the town of Glastonbury seizes their 7 cows to pay for back taxes. However, the sisters have named their cows things like Abigail Adams and Martha Washington. And they have 2 calves named Taxi and Vody. And Taxi and Vody are more and more together so that wherever Taxi goes, Vody will follow. Okay? Now, they then present this to reporters. They get their story out. They've learned this in abolition. They get that story out. And they, whenever anything happens or doesn't happen, in other words, there's silence around the issue, they will write to the Hartford Courant. They will write to the Springfield newspaper. They will invite reporters to their house because they know they have a significant story here. It is presented as the Boston Tea Party now in the 1870s.
And their story goes nationwide.
It goes nationwide, absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting that 2 elderly women and their cows could make such a big fuss.
And Taxi and Vody. I mean, you just can see their political and their media savvy in doing that.
And of course, they had really come to this through years of activism. In fact, Jason, you mentioned the newspaper that preceded William Lloyd Garrison's paper. They actually invited William Lloyd Garrison to speak at their home when Glastonbury wouldn't allow him to speak.
Right.
He was not allowed to speak in the town hall, so they invited him to speak on their front lawn stand on a tree stump and give a talk.
It's very interesting that I'm talking about the same kind of thing today as it relates to maybe the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement, and others, and referencing the Boston Tea Party, not about tea and a party, but about what young people call now turn up, about direct action and protest, and how that scene, you know, as we romanticize these things, history, that's seen as a revolutionary act for justice and a cause, and yet young people who may, in fact, turn up in their neighborhood or at a scene of an incident, then that they're seen and cast in a different kind of way, and that's not understood as an act, or as Dr. King said, the riot is the voice of the unheard. Right? So it's not seen in the same way. And I'm making those connections, that there are ways in which our history, our very beginnings history, point to that when some people turn up, when some people do direct action, when some people get involved in public witness and civil disobedience, that it's understood as a revolution, that it's understood as a just cause, while when others do that, then they're seen as thugs. All right, they're seen as domestic terrorists.
Jason, in the time that, and let's take off from that, in the time that Isaac Glasko and his partners became more activists and spoke out, how were they regarded? Troublemakers, I imagine.
I would imagine as well. There's very little evidence of what flowed out of that specifically. What's interesting, though, is that after that petition emerged, he was not involved in another lawsuit for another 17 years. So something clearly registered, but we know only through the absence of action in his specific case.
Interesting. Bishop Selders, how does this type of activism that Kathleen and Jason have so well described in the 19th century, how does this translate into the 20th century civil rights battles?
Sure. Obviously, the most celebrated is the modern-day civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, right? So that you have now Dr. King and Fannie Lou Hamer and all of the cast of characters. Now, the nation is abuzz and astir because what's happening down south now has national implications, right? Malcolm is involved in that, in the interesting connection to Hartford. Malcolm is the person and personality that brought Islam to Hartford and to Connecticut. He preached out and began to start the first mosque here. So Malcolm has a history here too. But their assassinations in the 1960s then muted to some degree some of our public witness and activism. I mean, the late Butch Lewis was involved in the Black Panther movement, had roots here in Hartford. But it waned, and I think in many ways you both have referenced what happened historically. It's also happened here in modern history, that you have this upswing of movement, and then we kind of elastically go back to the way things are, and it gets mute. Hartford had a significant brouhaha in response to Dr. King's assassination here, and that's very, very, very often not referenced and or remembered. Property was destroyed here and never rebuilt in the near north side of Hartford, and yet much of that is not referenced. I think today we are in another kind of moment where the nation is abuzz and astir, that the public discourse, our most recent, our current presidential candidacy this season has in it a racial context. I mean, it's far-field, and one of the candidates is very animated about what he thinks about difference and racial ethnic difference. But I think it is in that context and with that tone, we now have an opportunity to re-engage, and to re-engage civically. There is space for John and Jane Q. Citizen to say, okay, I do have a voice. That voice, that singular voice connected to other voices, could actually bring about community transformation and change. What I say often is turn up. Direct action creates the political space for community change and transformation to occur. It is our form of democracy that has taught the world that idea.
And if I might add, too, one of the things that just impresses me so about the Smiths, and it moves me, and it's in relation to what you're saying, is that the Smiths never expected to win. They were going to do it anyway. I mean, suffrage doesn't go through until 1919. They're dead for 30, 40 years by then. Abolition does not touch them personally. If they never got involved in abolition, they'd have a happy life. They do it anyway. The sisters used to say, do light right and let the heavens fall. That was one of their expressions, but they actually held by that. And sometimes when I get discouraged, seriously, when I get discouraged, I go back to the book and I hear them speaking and them saying, you know, there's a right way to live. There's an ethics which we must uphold irregardless. And that's what you're saying. So
I think it's interesting too, just to hear the ways that, and through my own work, that these narratives are all entwined, whether it's women's suffrage, civil rights for African Americans, civil rights for Native Americans. These conversations are informing one another, and they're growing from one another. And it seems to be happening at these moments where it might be the 1820s and 30s, it might be the 1930s, 40s, 50s. I mean, in fact, there's a Native American civil rights organization that is created in 1931 in Westerly, Rhode Island, that is for civil rights and education, and in response to some of the bigger issues going on.
And I was going to ask you a question about that, because I mentioned at the beginning of the introduction to the program that it's believed that Isaac Glasko had both Native American and African blood. So was he seen by his neighbors and by the larger community as African? Was he seen as Native American? And was he helping to propel Native Americans as well as people of African descent?
It's a very interesting question. I don't know from his own narrative. What I can infer is his engagement with the African recolonization, that he may have seen himself more in line with African interests. Another very famous person of color of mixed ancestry was the seafarer Paul Cuffey out of Massachusetts. His mother was a Wampanoag woman and his father was an African slave. And he sort of leveraged his, and probably in the same way Glasko did, leveraged his dual identity depending on situations where as a Native person he might be exempt from taxation. As an African person he may connect to a bigger issue engaging enslavement. His own physicality may reflect his African ancestry more, which is where he ended up directing his energy.
I think we have a question right here. Bill, if you could.
I'd like to go back to the 1823 petition. The language of the petition is very interesting because it complains about being excluded from certain places, places of honor. And I wonder from that if we might explore the nature of discrimination that Isaac Glasko and other people of color are experiencing. And we're not talking just about voting rights or representation in the legislature. We're also talking about social exclusion and economic exclusion. And in your presentation, you suggested this was a moment when the economic position of the community of color was deteriorating. They leave the land, maybe Mr. Glasko was losing business. So I'm wondering if you would explore a little bit more about the scope of discrimination that Mr. Glasko was experiencing and what he tried to do about it, and whether that has any lessons for us today.
Yeah, so I guess, where I kind of have wondered at that moment, what is that trigger point? And I always sort of reflect back on the Embargo Act of 1807. That might have been a moment in time that produced an economic tension. And I sort of look at that as, the Mexico Wall, right? So there's some interesting connections and tensions that exist at that moment. And that's where I really see the outflow, because things, there's some really great opportunities in that early republic where you start to see symbolic movements of white leaders and their interactions with black leaders and so on, Paul Cuffey being one of those people. But at that moment, you really start to see this decline, the deterioration of relations from the exclusion and the census, and people are becoming more vocal. I'm kind of mindful both of the African side and the Native American side as well, and there's very much, the re-engagement of this paternalistic system of management of society, of economy, of community. I mean, the state of Connecticut develops and expands an overseer system for all of the Native American communities in the state, in which they essentially lose rights and control over their resources. Everything is mandated now to be under the control of an individual overseer who controls the rent of their lands, who controls the money that's coming in from those rents, who's actually a citizen of those communities. So citizenship, I think, is really an important piece here, and I think the engagement of the sort of rebuffing those state actions, the community of color, or people in that community of color trying to engage their citizenship in different ways. And I think you start to see that reflected by people like Glasko. William Apes, I mentioned earlier, really is a very significant vocal advocate for indigenous rights and the rights of all people of color. And I would just recommend anybody who's interested in this reading his treatise called Indian Nullification, which really calls attention to the constitutional rights and the treatment of American Indians and the hypocrisy that people of color are experiencing.
We have time for another question if anybody has a comment or a question.
Diane, while somebody's formulating the question, I think what's also important to reference is that while there is this entrenching of a particular way white society in their treatment of black and Native American people, those communities were thriving and surviving. And so don't get that twisted up. While there is, folk who, there's blockage here to the larger society, those black people bought land next to each other for a reason. They created their own communities and their own economies. So by 100 years later, a Black Wall Street in Tulsa existed, where a whole thriving, wealth machine had been cultivated. So that, separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 really, was about public accommodation. We've made it now be about education because of how it came back to us in the 1950s. But it was, in fact, the black communities and Native American communities created their own societies, their own way of being in the world. And they did not allow what was undue pressure to participate in the larger community to affect their thriving and surviving. And so, I mean, that's often not understood, that those communities expanded and grew.
And if I can just add very quickly to what the bishop said, there are specific places. Bridgeport, Connecticut, there's a community of color, Little Liberia, or Ethiopia, as it was called, with the Freeman sisters at the center of that. This community had lending libraries, they had multiple churches, they had businesses that were theirs. These were the community creating their own because of that level of exclusion.
We have a question over here.
There was a certain level of political power that I see that Glasko might have obtained around that time, where he was able to maneuver things and create that community with people of color. And it reminds me of what the Irish did when they first came in. They were able to organize, they were marginalized, but they had this strong sense of community. So now with today, and when you want to take action, I find that the risk that we're talking about, there's such high risk that it's hard to want to take action. For example, in the city, if you speak up against political activity, you have a risk of pissing your boss off and making them mad. And then if you lose your job, what do you have? There's such high risk. What is there to do? I find that maybe we need to focus on community first and then action later. Is there a balance between both?
I'd like to answer that.
Yeah, you're right. This leaning into risk may mean the loss of some sort. And I think there is a balance. There is a way in which we've got to figure out how to sustain ourselves, and I start that by saying, especially for people of color, for black people, we got to love ourselves. And we got to love our black selves. We got to love how we are and who we are in much the same way that other groups of people love how and what the way they live. Right? And then that out of that love place, then it turns into public policy, public accommodation, and what I would call overall justice. Cornel West says, he says justice is what love looks like in public. Right? And I think there is a connection, and we got to battle for it. I mean, we got to struggle for it, so that my leaning into risk, or in particular you leaning into risk, while it may cost you a job here, the hookup is over here, that somebody says, I value this kind of activism. I value this kind of justice seeking, and it makes for a better society. What we have today in large instances is where we don't talk in public about what our community values really are. We live those values in isolation in places like Glastonbury and Simsbury and Avon today, where there are very few people of color. And there are reasons why those communities are created, and that, when we talk about public education here in the city of Hartford or Bridgeport or New Haven, where these are largely communities of color struggling, while other communities don't have those struggles, and how public education is funded through property taxes and the injustice or the injustice that exists there. These are all related, and I'm babbling on, but you get my meaning. They are connected, and you can't talk about one without these other issues having some relationship to one another. And we all are better when we all lift together. And I think we can do better. And that's the bottom line for me. We can do better today in many instances like our foreparents did. I mean, it was John Quincy Adams who argued the case at the Supreme Court that freed the Mindy who were on the Amistad. I mean, he understood that, as an elderly, son of a founder of this nation.
Jason, I I wanted to just give you an opportunity to mention the village. That, in fact, I just drove by there the other day. I was out. I was at Mashantucket for an event, and on my way back, I passed through Glasko.
Yes.
Why isn't it spelled correctly?
So this
Because it's spelled G-L-A-S-G-O, and his name is spelled K-O, right? Yeah.
Right, that's correct. So the subsequent industrial activity took on the Glasko thread mill and so on, and it actually was a post office clerk's error in the spelling that stuck, unfortunately, and it's been that way ever since.
Spelling counts.
Yes, in fact it does.
Let's change it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping this would actually lead to that effort.
Can we what do we have to do? Sign a petition? Or? Jason, I just wanted to give you a second to talk a little bit about the direction that you're taking the museum in, because I think some of us were alarmed when the museum closed for the first time, and here you have come in now to bring it back to life and to reopen it. And it sounds like you're making some substantial improvements and changes that'll give it some new vitality.
Yeah, so it's really been a team effort. The community's been heavily involved. I've been working with the broader Native community from across the region. I've got a great staff. Some of the most immediate changes that we're really looking to do is change. I mean, people really connect with our space, they connect with our exhibits, they connect with our research, and what I want to see is a greater fluidity as it emerges in places like our retail shop, in our restaurant, where we can really sort of focus on indigenous foods. We hired a Native American chef from the Wampanoag tribe who's bringing just incredible food now to enhance the experience. We have Native American artists and craftspeople who are now supplying the crafts and other artistic resources to our shop. So no more made in China. I was very happy about that. But probably one of the more significant things that relate actually to what we're talking about here is I really want to push the museum to take on more of an advocacy role for these types of issues. I think there are lots of things going on across Indian country and across the world where indigenous people are constantly sort of navigating violation of rights and resources, and not just the negative things, but the really great things, celebrating fashion, celebrating art and performance. And I want to bring all of these things to a much broader audience. We just actually are a week and a half out of our first Indigenous Fine Art Market that we hosted at the museum at the end of May, which we had 80 artists from across the country selling and showing their art. We had music, we had fashion show, we had food. So this is the kind of thing. Most of the attention has been on the Southwest for this type of thing, so we really want to make this about the East.
That's exciting, very exciting.
So,
I look forward to being back.
Please visit.
I'll give you a moment to, please visit. I'll give you a moment to kind of give us one last thought.
Well, I actually felt honored in being able to research the Smiths, and I hope you get that sense. I mean, there is a big component of our history, and you could hear it today, that we need to pay attention to, because it has made us who we are. And it can strengthen us when we need it to be strengthened. Sometimes we have to talk back to it, and we have to talk back to it loud. But it enriches us all. And for me, particularly, the Smith sisters were that kind of experience.
Thank you. Bishop Selders, one last thought?
Yeah, if we, I think a famous person said, if we don't pay attention, I'm paraphrasing, if we don't pay attention to history, we're bound to repeat it. And the inference is we're bound to repeat the bad stuff. We're bound to repeat the mistakes we've made. History gives us a viewpoint into how we act in groups, how we legislate, how we form community, and how we interact in that said community. We have a rich history here as I'm coming to become a New Englander. And so there is a rich history here that if we would engage it, we talk back to it, have conversation with it, we can then bold and predict our future if we claim it. And one other thing I would say is let's tell the truth about our history. Let's don't sugarcoat it. You know, again, the Boston Tea Party wasn't about tea and a party. It was really about revolution. Let's tell the truth. Our cities, our urban areas were created and have been created and nestled together to really occupy, you know, our people of color in space, while our more rural, more town communities are more white. And there's a reason why that is. And let's own that. And then let's figure out a way, as we regionally try to adapt ourselves, to figure out how we live together better.
Thank you so much, all three of you. Thank you for this wonderful program. It's great having you here. And thank you all for being with us today. You can see this program again on the Connecticut Network and on ct-n.com. Thank you.